Hi, everyone. Welcome. The University of Maryland welcomes you tonight to this evening's program, the Living Legacy National Speaking Tour, featuring David C. Driskell and Curley Holton. My name is Kara Folk, and I am the Regional Director for the Southeast Programming for the University of Maryland Alumni Association. And we are happy to partner with the David C. Driskell Center on this event. Our Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities will be along and will say a few words after. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Curley Holton and get the conversation started. So let's give him a big round of applause.
There we go. All right, thank you for being with us. We switched the program a little bit. The Dean is supposed to do the initial introductions, but she's delayed in traffic, so we thought we'd get started. Someone else is going to be sitting down. We'll give them a few moments. They're getting food. Yeah, please come on in, have a seat. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about the David C. Driskell Center first. It honors the legacy of David C. Driskell, and most of you are aware who David is. A distinguished university professor of art, emeritus, an artist, art historian, collector, curator, and philanthropist. And the center is committed to his legacy of preserving the rich heritage of African American art and its visual culture. It provides an intellectual home for artists, museum professionals, and scholars broadening the field of African diasporic studies. It's committed to collecting, documenting, and presenting African American art and visual art archives. It's committed to replenishing and expanding the field of African American art. David was born in 1931 in Georgia. You can see his academic credentials: 1955, a BFA from Howard University, 1962, an MFA from the Catholic University, and 1976, he curated the groundbreaking exhibition that has become the seminal text for the study of African American art, 2 Centuries of Black American Art, 1750 to 1950, monumental for the field of African American art history in the American art canon. In 1977 to 98, he taught art and art history at the University of Maryland. 2000, he was honored by President William Jefferson Clinton as one of 12 recipients of the National Humanities Medal. In 2007, Professor Driskell was elected to the National Academy by the National Academy. In 2018, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we're going to share with you that story of David's living legacy. He reminded me recently that living legacy means something after you've gone to the cabin in the sky. But what we want to do is share this legacy with you and individuals around the country. So we've been on a tour called the National Legacy Tour, where we have these dialogues and discussions. It's important that David's narrative is present, that it is shared with you. Now, a number of books have been published on his work, a number of catalogs, but there is a personal story that I think represents our story, and it's important to share that story with us. So we're going to focus, each time we do these talks, we tailor it to the audience and the environment. Now, we're at Art Basel, Art Miami, so we're going to talk a little bit about art. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're in a classroom having Art 101 with Dr. Driskell. And then we're going to move you to intermediate level, 200 level of art. And then if you're ready, we're going to take you to the advanced level of art with theory and philosophy. All this reflects David's experience. Now, some of you might have heard the story of David's beginning, his leaving his home as a young man after studying in a one-room schoolhouse in the South, segregated education system, and how he took a train and came to Washington, D.C. to attend school at Howard University. And David apparently arrived at Howard, walked on campus, went into the building, and went into a classroom and sat down. Had never applied for admission, just assumed he was going to college. And later, after a few challenges by administration, they eventually allowed him to go through the process and attend. And what was important was he was at Howard at a critical moment in its history. He had teachers like Lois Mailou Jones, James Porter, Elaine Locke was teaching philosophy, and a number of not Hal Woodruff, but James Wells was teaching in printmaking. Later on, as David developed his chops as a teacher and educator, he just had mentors like Hal Woodruff, Roman Bearden, and others. So what I want to do is travel that journey with David, especially as a young teacher. And his first teaching position, this is David at Howard University, his first teaching position was at Talladega College. So, David, I want you to look at this photograph. Can you see this young man here? What happened to him? This was your first teaching position.
Yes.
And if I understand correctly, you were the entire department.
Okay.
You were a one-man department, is that true?
That is true. I taught everything that was in the curriculum, whether I was prepared or not. I said I was because I wanted a job.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I'm going to bite it if I hold it any longer. Okay, thanks, Dorit. You know, Dorit is the person who keeps us going at the Driskell Center. Whenever things are moving in the wrong direction, she corrects us. And we thank her for that. I often tell that at my church in Washington, Sunday, People's Congregational Church, one of the former students came up to me and she said, you know, I'm not going to ask you how old you are. She said, because I'm 80. And she said, you were our teacher down there, and you had to have been older than we were, and that was true. And I did tell her, I said, well, I'm 87 and a half. I always put that half on, because every day counts when you get to that age. And we were reminiscing about Talladega and how I had come there, and one of the questions they asked me was, can you teach ceramics? And I said, yes. Hadn't had a ceramic course. So I arrived early and read books ahead of my students and indeed taught ceramics. And she was saying, you know, you had us going out digging the clay, processing it, making glazes and so forth and so on. But she didn't know that I hadn't had that experience myself. But I must have done a pretty good job because she remembered it, and she remembered it well. So the beginning, I had to teach etching, printmaking. I had to teach painting, sculpture, of course, art history, and art education. Hadn't had a course in art education, but I got Victor Lowenfeld's book and several others. Mm-hmm. And I came off as pretending to be an expert. So that was my beginning.
So at the moment that you were teaching, you were also learning.
I was learning, yes. I was learning as I went along.
And historically, this says something about just the beginning of art departments in traditionally black universities and colleges.
Yes, most of our historically black colleges and universities, as you know, did not have art departments per se. They had one person who taught art. And later on, well, with the exception of schools like Howard and Hampton and Fisk and so forth, but later on, the state universities added more faculty. One of the major schools was the one that Texas Southern, where Dr. John Biggers taught. So that was just one example of how these schools came along after the other schools, and of course had eminence and prominence in the arts.
This is similar to Fisk too, with Hal Woodruff at Fisk University.
No, Hal was at Atlanta. Aaron Douglas was at
Fisk.
at Fisk, and he was the only teacher there for the first 15 or so years. And then they added a part-time person. When I came to Fisk University in 1966, Aaron had one part-time person. He was retiring. And I came with the notion that I could ask for a faculty of 3 people. And I got a faculty of 3 people. And later, that faculty grew to be a total of 8. When I left to go to the University of Maryland, 3 of whom were part-time. But we had grown to 5 full-time people in art. And that was quite good for a small liberal arts college.
So, but these young students were, not too much younger than you. I mean, close to your age.
Well, yes, that's what Florence, the former student, was saying. They were just a few years younger than I. And at Fisk, the young artists like Terry Atkins and Adrian Jenkins and others, they went on to make names for themselves of importance. And regrettably, Terry Atkins died about 4 years ago, but he was just beginning to make the international art scene in a big way.
And this continued much later on as well, because when you were at Maryland, a little later on, and we'll get to that, it was a location that had the largest number of PhD student candidates studying African American art in the country. And they were coming to UMD to study with David, because he had that reputation for 2 centuries of African American art and was accessible to them. And he was creating a generation of scholars and teachers of African American art like no other place in the country. Here he is teaching at the University of Maryland. Now we're moving on to 200 level now. So you've had your introduction to drawing, painting 101, watercolors, and now we're doing what we call methods and materials, experimentation with new materials.
Yeah, that was a course I introduced at Howard University in 1965. And it was a course where students experimented with the basics in art. Professor Porter, James A. Porter, had taught a course in fresco painting and encaustic painting. And when he was near the retiring age, of course, he asked me to take over those courses. Now, I had studied methods and materials with the very famous paint maker at Skowhegan, Leonard Beaucourt, and the artists out there will know Beaucourt colors for years later on became golden colors. If you buy those colors, they're golden, made by Golden. And I was Leonard Beaucourt's assistant at the Skowhegan School in 1953 when I was a student there. And that's where I became interested in raw materials. And so when I came to Howard University, I would take my students out nearby fields in Maryland to actually dig clays like ochres and umbers and what have you. Those materials are still out there, but you have to know them and have to know where they are to get them. And so I developed a series of courses, first on the undergraduate level, and then graduate students could take the course, whereby they could understand what really went into the making of paints. We would grind them, sieve them out, and of course put them into tubes, just as one would do in a manufacturing process. Now, my colleagues used to say, "Are you still teaching that luxury course?" Well, because you could go downtown and buy oils cheaper than making them. But it was the knowledge.
But you were taught that as a classically trained artist.
I was taught that, yes.
In your graduate studies at Catholic University and at The Hague, how to make these materials.
Yes.
So there was a tradition that you were exposing these students to that has been lost in many ways now.
Well, yes. When you, for example, if you're a painter and you're talking about chiaroscuro painting that goes all the way back to the Renaissance, then you have to know what the materials are, what vehicles are used to glaze and do all of these things. Doesn't come, modern students
and
don't.
Of course, chiaroscuro is a casting of shadows
Yeah.
in the painting. When you look at Rembrandt and other painters, Italian painters, you see the deep shadows. That's that technique he's talking about.
Right.
This is art 200 level that you're getting right now.
Well, you know, in contemporary studies, we seldom find those kinds of things happening. People buy paint and they go and paint. And I always felt that one needed to know the essence of the thing, needed to know the roots. For example, in abstraction, you know, I've had students who come in my classroom the first day they want to do an abstract painting. And my question was, what are you abstracting from? It implied that you had a knowledge of something that you could reduce it to. Because abstraction is the essence of that form. It's the reduction of it to have just the minimum amount of involvement with a certain kind of form. Well, very often they didn't have any knowledge. They'd seen an abstraction and they said, well, I can do that. Well, it's not quite that easy.
So you were introducing the philosophy of art to them.
The philosophy and theory.
And not only that, a sense of divine nature of art.
Well, yes, artists are arrogant enough to believe that they are divinely inspired. You know, for whatever reason would all these people want to collect what they do? Because otherwise you go out and do it yourself. But there must be some connection to that realm that we don't always know as much about as we think we do, that mysterious realm of being. And so I studied philosophy with the notion that I would enhance my own knowledge of why artists do what they do. And I think I was greatly rewarded by having done it.
And that was also an intersection of your early religious training. I know your father was a Baptist minister, so this sense of divine, this sense of preciousness of certain things and ritual was important in your life, not just profane things, not just activity. And then when you go into the practice of art, that there's an intention behind the making of that art. And we're at a time right now where that becomes even more important because of the commercial assignment to art. We've been seeing in auction houses the large prices, like a Kerry James Marshall at $20 million. And that, in many ways, that removes the artwork from you, from the individual. And it puts a glow around it, this mystical aura around it, but it is just taking the sacredness away from the artwork, because the sacredness is in the relationship to the individual and the viewer and accessibility. And I think that has always been present in your work, the sense of grace and divine quality.
Well, if you go back to classical training of the artist, and you go back to the Middle Ages, where much of the philosophy of art was formulated, and I like to refer back to the scholastics. In scholasticism, the notion of art was that it was the right reason for making the thing that needs to be made. In the Latin, recta ratio factibilium, right reason for making, which means that you wouldn't be sitting in a chair here today if there wasn't a reason to make you more comfortable. And so art in those eras was based on principle.
Not just ideals.
Not just ideas,
but principles.
But principles and usefulness. And I always try to inculcate in the minds of my students the origin of this whole thing about art. You don't just go and start painting. You have an idea. And if you go back to the philosophy of making, all the way back to Plato, then you would have the notion that, first of all, there is the idea of the thing, the idea stage. Everything starts, even with writing, with music, with composition, with dance. It starts with an idea. And then you bring it down through various forms of causation. What is the cause for making this thing?
300 level.
First of all, the idea is always, according to Aristotle, on the side of the mind. And from the mind, it is transcribed. It transcends material through manual dexterity, through the hand and the mind working together.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the process of causation. And causation, of course, is that first there's the idea. And secondly, the idea is moved to what might be referred to as the material cause.
And it's a driver in your own work, your own personal work.
I've always tried to apply it to what I'm doing. I'm not sure that I always did it. Now, I don't sit down and say, this is the formal cause, and it's this, and this is the material cause. That means you're choosing what you're going to make it from. And then one of the most important points in that, and this is where the critic comes in, the writer, and Halima's sitting here. She's a great writer and critic and so forth. We need those people who are testing us in this process of causation. If you choose the wrong material for making that thing, then you're not going to be successful. So material cause is very important. Don't choose glass if you're going to chisel something. I mean, that's material causation.
So it has an intention.
Yes.
And a motivation. So David not only achieved a large distinction as an educator, as you can see, significant distinction, but as a scholar as well, a scholar that had to be a scholar. He was told that it was going to be his role by one of his mentors. And he went about preparing himself for that. I asked him a question early on in our relationship, and we've been working together now about 15 years, is why you? Why this singular reality and experience, why you? And I think he never quite answered it completely to me, so I'm going to guess part of it. Not only was he disciplined and dedicated and willing to do what was necessary to learn, study, and prepare himself, that was recognized by others, but he did it with a certain kind of grace and a certain kind of humility. And I think all of you that know him recognize that in him. So I think that generated a lot of interest in what he was able to do and for others to be mentors of him. I'll give you an example. You know, I did a project with David in San Jose, Costa Rica. A very large print, Woman in Interior, which we have, Pat has one of those. We invited 30 collectors to subscribe to the edition with understanding that they received 2, and 1 went to a museum that didn't have David's work. So it went to 30 institutions. So we rented a penthouse floor of a hotel in San Jose, Costa Rica with 5 bedrooms. We had David, Rodney was there, Julie McGee was videotaping it. I had 2 students and a printmaker working with me. We also rented a studio, a full studio with a cook and everything. So we were doing it in Costa Rica. And one evening I get a phone call. Now I've been going to Costa Rica for many years because I studied in Latin America and Mexico early on, so I had an affinity for printmaking in Latin America. So I've been going for many years. And I received a phone call one night from the curator of the Presidential Collection of Costa Rica. And she said, I understand David Driskell is in San Jose. And I'm thinking, I've been coming in for years and nobody ever called and said, I understand Curley is in San Jose. We'd like to have you come to the presidential palace. So they invited David and the rest of them. We sort of followed along to see the collection of the president of Costa Rica, and included in that collection was Woman in Interior in Costa Rica. Now that's one story as a practicing artist. Now, I'm gonna tell you another little story. As a teacher, Dorit and I was doing a presentation about the Driskell Center at a conference in Athens, Greece. And David was in Italy at the same time we were in Athens. And David said, look, I'm going to come over to Athens for the conference also to see the presentation. But I remember I had 2 students that went to Howard that are Greek students that live in Athens. And he remembered both their names. Dorit tracked them down, and they came to the hotel to meet David. They were students of David's, and they attended the March on Washington with David. Was that 1965?
1963, 64.
1963. And they were with their beloved teacher. We were just amazed. And it was his birthday, so they hosted him for his birthday. And I thought it was so odd. How did these 2 Greek women get to Howard University? One said she went there because they have the Greek colors at Howard. The flag is the same blue and white. And she said, I understood they taught Greek at Howard. So she went there thinking they were teaching Greek. But it wasn't that they were teaching Greek. It had the Greek system. But she ended up teaching Greek to the students in the Greek system. And the second woman went because
that was Sophia Zarambuka.
Darabuka? Okay.
Yes.
And that one was the wife of the ambassador?
No, Sophia was the publisher.
Okay, Sophia was the publisher.
Berenica Giatrakis was the wife of the
ambassador.
Minister of Finance under Papandreou.
But they opened up a sketchbook that they had did as students with a picture of David Driskell marching in the front of the March on Washington. They had a little sketch. These are students that never forgot this teacher. And you can name the number of students and historians that begin their lectures with paying homage to David because he opened the field. So now he was at Fisk. So he was at Fisk when he began the research on 2 centuries, then came to University of Maryland. And I was really intrigued because he had did this research at Fisk. The exhibition opened at LACMA to the largest attending audience in the history of that museum. 80,000 people came to that opening. Then it went to the High Museum.
The Dallas
Museum, and then Brooklyn Museum.
The Brooklyn Museum.
So this was making history, and David was, I don't know how he kept a job because he was traveling all over the world talking about this exhibition. There had never been a comprehensive study that was this in-depth and covered such critical material. And not only was it important for us, white scholars were aware of Henry O. Tanner, but not much else. And they couldn't believe that this material existed. So the work that we do as artists of color plays a very important role, not just as an aesthetic object, a beautiful object. It is a record of our cultural practice, the way we see ourselves and the way we see the world. And David was a custodian of that. All right? Now I'm going to give you a few minutes to ask some questions about David, unless you want me to continue this teaching, this 300 level teaching that we got going. Keep going? All right, now.
I didn't finish my causation.
Okay, finish your causation.
To the final points is that after you select your material, you've done the right thing of selecting the right material. Then what do you have to do? you have to apply yourself to work it. And we call that the efficient cause. The efficient cause. How well you do it will determine whether or not it is art. And that's where your critics, your historians, and all these people come in. They're going to sit in judgment on what you do. You advance it from the everybody can have an idea, but can they move it from the idea stage to the material cause, where you select the right material, and where you then do it with hand and mind together. And then when the work is finished, that is the final cause, and that is the work of art in its essence.
They say there are three elements to understanding a work of art. The first is design. That is the subject you're looking at. Is this a still life? Is this a figure? Is this material, charcoal, paint? The design element, the material used, or the assignment given to a student, or an assignment taken on by the artist, what I'm making work about. Second is called modulation. How you use the material, how effective you are at the use of that material, how you use paint, how you look, for example, where you look at the work of William T. Williams and how William T. uses paint, or Sam Gilliam, how he uses paint. So it's how they manipulate that material and give voice to it. And the third is recapitulation. That's how you react to it. When you look at it, how does it speak to you? Now, David gave you this long philosophical academic causation thing. I call it smart art. Look for smart art, intelligent art, like we look for it in everything else in our lives, with close scrutiny, looking at it closely. What is this artist talking about? Why is this artist talking about this? And how are they talking about it? Are they articulate? Are they illuminating something for me? So it's important to consider that. This is the same thing David is talking about, but he has this academic kind of formula. So, but the motive is the same. So David continues to practice as an artist, a serious artist, as you know. He's represented by D.C. Moore Gallery from New York that's at the Convention Center. I've told you early on in the introduction his recognition as a member of the Academy. The first African-American member of the Academy of Arts, National Academy of Arts, was, guess who?
Henry O. Tanner.
Henry O. Tanner. Who was number 2? Huey Lee Smith. Who was number 3? Richard Mayhew was number 3. And David has joined the Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is the most prestigious organization that recognizes creative artists and scientists.
I was in President Obama's class.
You were in President Obama's class?
Yes.
Oh, you want to talk about classes. You know some of the students he had in his class? Stokely Carmichael?
Yes.
Was a student in his class?
Kwame Ture.
Made
yes,
him radicalized him, too. But that's what he did.
Well, those were the Howard days.
At Howard University. Leontine Price?
No. I'm
You
not
had a
that,
singer
I'm
sitting
not
in
that
the
old now.
You had a singer sitting.
Jesse Norman.
Jesse Norman, the singer.
And Harold Wheeler, and, Dancing with the Stars and all of those.
Chenault was in a class? From
That
American
was at
Express?
Bowdoin.
At Bowdoin? From
Kenneth
American,
Chenault. That was
CEO
at
of
Bowdoin
American
College.
Express.
Yeah.
All because of Maestro Driskell's inspiration. Do we have some?
Well, I wasn't the only reason.
That's the only one.
There were other people who inspired them, but at that time, I always go back because I get a lot of questions on the road about, well, you left historically black colleges and went to the University of Maryland. Yeah, I had taught at historically black colleges for 22 years when I left Fisk University and came to Maryland. And I came because at that time I would be able to teach one class and do my research, whereas at our schools, you can't just teach one class. You got to teach more than one class. We don't have that luxury. And it's not that I was forsaking them, anything like that, because I still contribute to the schools and go and lecture and what have you. But there comes a time in your career where you have to fish or cut bait. And it was time, if I was going to do the research that I wanted to do, to really concentrate on teaching and doing the research. So
this is in recognition of David's achievement as a distinguished university professor. In 1997, he received
97.
the Maryland Presidential Award Medal. In 1997, he received the University of Maryland Presidential Medal, acknowledging his distinguished role as a teacher at the university. You want to? And then finally, I think many of you are aware of this, he received the National Humanities Medal from President Clinton. Now we got a few minutes for questions, and then the Dean of Arts and Humanities, who has made this possible for you today, is going to come up and say a few words to you. So any questions for Dr. Driskell before we bring the Dean up? Yes.
Okay. Dr. Driskell, my
Yes.
pleasure. Of course, you're aware of the Harlem Renaissance and what it meant, both in terms of as a turning point socioeconomically as well as in arts and culture. And I'm wondering, looking at these times, do you see any parallels between then and now?
Oh, that's a very good question. I really do. And how? In that the forces have been marshaled all over the country. You could go from California to Maine and find African American artists who are very productive. They are not in a group whereby we could say we have a philosophy as we did in the Harlem Renaissance. We had a philosopher by the name of Valiant Locke who said we must return to the ancestral arts of Africa for inspiration. Well, we are not a monolithic group in the sense that we do one thing now, but we do our thing in different ways and in different places. So you can travel the entire country and find all but revolutionary movements going on amongst African American artists. And one of the most important things about it today is you will find more women artists participating than you did even during the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was rather sexist in certain ways. You know, we don't like to talk about that. But I didn't know Augusta Savage, but Romare Bearden told me, and Jacob Lawrence also told me, that Augusta Savage really stopped producing art because she was ostracized and criticized and kind of pushed aside, to the extent that she all but destroyed some of her own work because she didn't feel that she could be included in that magic number. So that's one thing we've overcome. Some of our heroes and sheroes today, you know, especially the greats like Elizabeth Catlett and others, Faith Ringgold, and so many others we could name here, Betty Starr and what have you. They are still working. Of course, Betty is deceased, but Faith is still working. Betty Starr is still working. And other things that we could point to would be the way America is beginning to wake up. I don't pay much attention to that article in the New York Times, in 2015, pretending that black artists are marching into the museums. They can't march there if nobody buys their work. They aren't marching in. They are making their presence known It's up to the curators and the directors and those people who buy art to make sure that they get to the museums. Now, what we don't always know in the African American community is that most of the works that go into the museum collections are donated by someone, and most cases by white patrons. Now, we're beginning to have that happen in the African American community. Many collectors, African American collectors, are donating works to major museums, to historically black colleges, and what have you. So in a certain sense, there is a renaissance going on in certain ways. It's not being written down the way it was in the Harlem Renaissance, but it is happening, and I think the whole of America is beginning to look. You go to Tate Modern in London, and you see a work by Mark Bradford, and they will have paid $8 or $10 million for it. That is progress. Now, the question is, when are we going to do it here? A little of it is happening, but we need more of it happening.
A question over here, young man.
Can you give him the mic, because I can't quite hear him?
Any words of advice for the artists that are showing here, either in Prizm or just during Miami Art Basel Week?
Any advice for young artists that are showing
any
here?
advice? I'm sorry. Well, the most important thing is to keep at it. Work hard. Read, read, read. Go to museums. And practice your craft from the point of view that you are dedicated to it. Don't let anything get in the way of it. You know, there's so many distractions out there, but the most important thing is to stick with it and seek advice. Don't declare yourself, what's the term that's so often used? I'm some kind of master. I forget the term, but I hear it often. I'm 87 and a half years old, and I'm not a master. So how can you be a master just, you know, by declaring it yourself?
I'm one.
Well, I laid hands on you.
Good. Another question. Yes, last question before we bring up the dean.
I want to flip the script on your discussion about museums acquiring black art. Can you speak to museums that are deaccessioning artwork today due to the lack of, you know, funds or being short on their endowments?
Maestro can answer that question better than I.
To be honest with you. But there are regulations for that. There are rules. You can only deaccession select bodies of work, and that fund can only be used to either restore or acquire additional works. What these institutions have been doing sometimes is trying to use it for other purposes, buildings, maintenance, and other kind of things, and that's where it's problematic, or for their endowment. It has only been the Association of Museums, only Alliance of Museums, which publish museum practices, which we adhere to at the Driskell Center, can only be used after due diligence and sold to buy additional works or the restoration of works in certain situations.
I would like also to add that there seemed to be, I don't know if a movement, but there are a few museums that recently deaccessioned some of the very important art, like Warhol, for example, in order to buy works by female artists as well as African American artists. This example is the Baltimore Museum of Art, and they just done it recently and purchased works by 6 African American artists. So.
The Baltimore Museum of Art did that.
Hi, David. But if you leave, like if you gift to the Driskell Center or to the Walters Museum or to National Gallery of Art, don't you have the right to, if you're going to gift a significant piece of work, like a Tanner or something like that, don't you have the right to indicate to them that you're only going to gift this if they never deassess, and it's in the contract?
Most museums and institutions, there's a clause in the gift that does not allow you to have that right. That does not allow you to have that right. That you can indicate that, and if that's acceptable to the institution, that's fine. But most museums reserve the right to have ownership of that work. And is that right, Doreen?
It's right, but I would guess that if you give a Tanner to the Driskell Center, we will accept that rule.
We will promise to keep
We'll
it
promise
forever.
to keep it, exactly.
So yeah, it depends on the institution and its practices. All right, I'm going to bring the dean up, and then I'm going to say a few comments after the dean speaks, because next year we're going to attempt to bring our very successful collector's school to Art Basel next year.
Okay, I've got a mic. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm not going to say a lot because I know you've heard David and you want to probably talk to him and Curley and hear more. And those of you I'm so excited to really have the opportunity to work with the Alumni Association to really invite and feature the College of Arts and Humanities and the Driskell Center here in South Florida with many of our friends and alums from this area. I'm so glad that you're here and have had an opportunity to hear this conversation. Those of us who hear David in conversations are really amazed at his memory. I'm sure you heard some of that tonight, but dates and places and people and all kinds of things that I cannot even begin to remember. It's always impressive. So we're really excited to be able to feature this conversation and to move it around the country. The other thing I would say is that the College of Arts and Humanities, I think, you know, when I had hoped to be here earlier and my plane was not delayed, I was going to say a lot about the College of Arts and Humanities, but I don't need to say that because I think in listening to David talk, what you hear is the ways in which the humanities and the arts inform, enrich one another, and really lead to the kind of artwork that can really change the world. So I thank you for coming out. I hope you will. Those of you who are alums to really engage in the Alumni Association, to join, become life members, to support, to volunteer, and to give to the university, to the Driskell Center, and to support black artists. I mean, one of the important things about the Driskell Center really was that it was established not only to honor and promote and disseminate information about the legacy of the work of distinguished university professor Emeritus David C. Driskell, but also to really build the next generation of scholars and artists and to support them. And so that is the work that we are trying to do. That is the work that we appreciate your engagement in and support, and we ask you to continue to do that. I am finished now. Thank you for coming.
Again, I want to mention again the Collector's School. We host each year. We normally have 30 to 35 members of that Collector's School. It's over a 3-day period. We bring in speakers who talk about the care of artworks, collecting artworks. We have collectors who share their collections with you. We have estate people that talk about how to position that artwork for their estate. We have appraisers that come in. We have archivists that come in and talk to you. Then we do this game of guests about different arts. We spin the little wheel of art and those kind of things. I always wanted to be a host of Wheel of Fortune, so we do that. But my point is that we're trying to really bring this material to the audience. In March, we actually have a panel of art managers, which includes Halima, will talk about how they manage the careers of artists. So we want to thank you again, and a special thank you to Kara from the Alumni Association, the Dean, and of course, Dorit Yaran, Deputy Director, who manages all these kind of details for us tonight. And there's some refreshments that I think are still there, so hang around for a little bit. Yes. Oh, yes, we have an artist panel on Friday. I think we have 5 artists that are involved. 6 artists that are going to be involved. It's from 12 to 2 p.m. It's going to be here. It's going to be fantastic. And the discussion points, the theme of those discussions are going to be provocative and challenging and speak to some of the contemporary issues going on in the art world that we raised a little bit tonight about pricing of artists' work, who asserts the value of artists' work. One of the things that David and I have been talking about is that the artist has lost their voice and talking about the meaning of work. It has been surrendered. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson when we meet on Friday about the Ruskin and James Whistler's. Remember the lawsuit over his painting? So we're going to talk about that to let you know that this is an old issue, but it is going on right now, and I think artists should claim the right to define what they produce. Thank you.